Greetings. I'm Michael Quinn Patton and have the honor and privilege today to talk with Vinod Thomas about his new book on risk and resilience in the era of climate change. He brings enormous experience in evaluation and development to this work. It's very timely and very important. And uh, I'm glad to get an opportunity to have him elaborate some of the ideas in the book. Then let me begin by asking you to talk some about your professional history.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. This is a great honor and privilege. Briefly, I have worked at the World Bank for the good part of my career in various functions. In the beginning as a researcher and at the end as an evaluator. The quality of development and sustainability of development, they have been my driving passion. I started even before the World Bank as a professor, and now in the last 10 years have come back to that in Singapore and in the Philippines, where I'm right now, teaching economics and evaluation. And in this connection, that is with the book, Climate Change, which kind of goes back in 1991. I headed the World Development Report at the World Bank, and it was on the whole theme of development. At that time, I had to struggle to bring in the environment, let alone climate change, as a factor that could be decisive in how much and how well we develop societies. So that was the background, and I'll just mention one more thing in that struggle. That is in the in Brazil. I was the country director for some time, and the whole purpose of the World Bank work was to see if the strategy for development can be enriched. And economic growth clearly was one factor. Human development too. I had to struggle to see whether the environment leg or the sustainability part could be a third piece of what the programs would drive for. It eventually happened, but it clearly was a struggle. Now, at this moment in writing the book, it is with a sense of urgency and much more concern over what may not happen in the coming decades unless a transformational change takes place in development, having squandered decades in not pursuing sustainable development. And that's on the part of both the multilateral organizations as well as the countries. And that brings us to the topic of our book.
One of the important points you make that not everybody seems to be up to date with is that we are in a different era. You title the book The Era of Climate Change. So talk about that. I mean, much of developments and certain evaluation seems to think that now that we're out of the pandemic, it's back to business as usual. That was a temporary lapse that changed things for a while, but now we're back to business as usual. But you really are arguing that the era of climate change puts us in a different place in human history and in evaluation. So talk about that. Is this what makes this era different?
Perhaps in talking about that, I might refer to two or three particular aspects that make the coming years and actually the current situation distinctly different with great implications for how evaluations need to be done. Going back to basics, economic growth and the way we measure it, GDP, really runs the show. Whether we like it or not, that's what the finance ministers really are aiming for. There's a good part to that, which is that, health, education, welfare seem to go with countries getting richer to a large extent. However, it's gross domestic product. It's a gross concept. I can't imagine us measuring well-being or any other attribute in gross terms without netting out the damages caused. And so that has always been there. But what makes the era of climate change different is that there is no more room for squandering that opportunity to go and worry about the net rather than worry about the gross. And to the extent that evaluation, one way or the other, captures GDP as a measure or even project rate of returns, they are all in the end come back to concepts of growth in gross terms. That way of doing things, unless that is changed, and that I would include in the transformational change, perhaps all bets are off. And so that would be one piece specifically on why the era of climate change is different. And if I may just add, it's on the both the positive and the negative side. The pervasive nature, the pandemic, yes, that was pervasive too. It affected everything, but so is climate change, from health to education, just to getting to places, just getting on with life. All of everything is affected. So the pervasive nature is distinct, different, and that has a positive side in the sense that you can think of co-benefits. You can worry about the air pollution in New Delhi. The co-benefit of doing that would be that it also allows you to control carbon emissions that cause climate change, because the sources of both air pollution and carbon emissions are the same, similar at least. So the whole focus on linkages, connectivity, co-benefits, all of that really rise to the surface in this era of climate change. And if I may just add a third and final point here, that would be that because of the rapid changes embodied in the climate change, our work, particularly of evaluation, needs to be cognizant of midterm, mid-course adjustments and corrections, retrofits, and just being alert and looking for those dynamic elements that we may have given short shrift to in the past.
One of those is the criterion that you make a center point of the book, and that is resilience. The OECD criteria that really have always struck me as project criteria, not systems transformation criteria. That call for evaluating on effectiveness and efficiency and impact and continuity, but resilience is a different kind of outcome and impact. So talk about resilience as an evaluation criterion. That strikes me as quite important from a dynamic systems point of view.
Absolutely. Perhaps I can root that in risk to a certain extent. I mean, risk and resilience, they're not exactly mirror images, but resilience goes beyond dealing with a particular risk. But nevertheless, risk presents us with the chance that things could go wrong. And then if they did go wrong, how terrible it would be. Or no, there can be a positive risk as well. But the product of those two things give us that gives us the risk profile. Resilience deals with that and goes further. In the era of climate change, the concept of resilience really has a powerful implication for how we think about development. And that is, if we thought, as you mentioned, Michael, earlier about the pandemic, getting back to how things were, if we thought that if you fall from the bed and you get back, that is resilience, yes. But if the stream of events that are coming our way are progressively more difficult, then it's not enough to just get back onto the bed. You need to go further. So rather than building back or getting back to how things were, it looks like we need to build forward and go one step further, and the idea of prevention comes squarely into the place. So from the evaluation perspective, resilience has a center place now, and it means embodying prevention activities that protect us but goes further into more uncertain territories as we go forward. In this, I guess I can add one element that makes this very difficult to do. And so people may shy away from dealing with resilience, not only because maybe it's a realization that has come now, but also the methods and the ways of doing it are not easy. Risk, perhaps you can deal, financial risk, all kinds of modeling takes cognizance of that. But uncertainty goes much more into uncharted territory, and it's much more unknown. And building resilience in that sense goes beyond risk management and anticipating how one might be prepared for the unknown. And so in that sense, for the evaluators, the methods of both assessing that and giving credit to where when it's done well is a challenge. So yes, resilience is being recognized, but the uncertainty associated with it and the growing difficulty of both anticipating it correctly, but also having systems in place to deal with that, that is a challenge. And that in turn makes evaluation tougher.
The importance of risk analysis, as you point out in the book, and taking it seriously. I mean, when the logical framework first came into play, that included a risk analysis, but it became a sort of boilerplate approach to risk analysis. You're talking about a different level of risk analysis that would include evaluators being involved in that as a baseline. I take it that evaluators have to learn to build in as part of their baseline in working with stakeholders a more in-depth approach to risk analysis.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And perhaps we can look at this in a graduated way. At the very micro specific level, there is the need to build in risk. For instance, the climate disasters are obliging countries to build in climate proofing into every project. You need a sheet now to show that an infrastructure project or an education project, what have you, meets the criteria for being climate proof. The contingency that's allowed to deal with the project expenses needs to also factor in it, and all sorts of estimates that suggest that doing so is sound economics, in the sense that a 10% increase in the way you build the house, anticipating downsides down the road, they pay off in a remarkable way down the road. So that's a very specific aspect of it. But beyond that, as you go further, the idea that unfavorable events can repeat and in greater frequency and in unknown ways than before, obliges us to do stress tests that central bankers do all the time with financial modeling. But in the case of climate change, those stress tests are a bit more complicated. We are not doing even the simple ones, which you can call a sensitivity analysis, in the financial world. What happens if the interest rate goes up? How does the debt look? Okay, that's one-to-one, two variables, etc. But in the case of climate change, we just finished saying there is the health side, there's the infrastructure side, the education side. So without getting overwhelmed with the enormity of the interconnections, one can or one should look at two or three of the main ingredients and do this kind of stress analysis. What happens if the California fires repeat every year, which is already happening, or the great floods of Thailand, rather than happening once in 10 years, they happen every 5 years, and so on and so forth.
Part of that is an environmental impact, but what seems to be especially challenging for countries to deal with is the increasing number of refugees, what are now being even called climate refugees, large populations of people displaced. And that seems to be especially challenging to anticipate and deal with politically as well as socially and economically.
Absolutely. I think when you think of this cascading effects of various factors, the social side and the environmental side really interact. And the term climate refugees actually is quite accurate, in the sense that areas of a country are rendered uninhabitable and or at least difficult to make a living in, whether it's heat waves or floods. And the numbers that the World Bank has been putting out on climate refugees, they get outdated every year. The numbers are just going up. So this has huge social economic repercussions and implications as well. So anticipating this without being so overwhelmed as to throw up our hands, and a challenge, as we said, in the case of resilience. So both risk and resilience need to come in, but the task would be to make them doable in terms of the analysis and evaluation, and focus on the main factors.
Two other concepts that you introduce that are really timely and important and discuss at length are mitigation and adaptation. So talk about the difference between those and how you see mitigation and adaptation connected to risk and resilience.
Absolutely. Yeah, these terms, adaptation and mitigation, have a great currency with climate change, but they go well beyond that, and they apply across a whole spectrum of events. One could think of adaptation as coping. It doesn't mean taking fate as a given, but it does mean that the focus would be very much on doing as well as you can. And there are several aspects of that. It includes such things as uh, sharing the burden with others, let's say with insurance, and moving out of harm's way, or even accepting the fate. All of that could be considered one way or another adaptation. Mitigation, on the other side, would be more on the side of prevention. You do things to ameliorate the impact that is going to happen. What is extraordinary and very important to recognize is the interaction between the two. If you had concentric circles, adaptation and mitigation, they do merge in the center, and there are a number of steps that do both. Now, that is important because, at least in the era of climate change, is there a priority? Should we do one or the other? Um, well, if the die has been cast and the carbon emissions are so high already that the goose is cooked for the next several decades, well, then you've got to adapt. But if adaptation is all that we did, then it will be difficult to ever keep up with the future impacts. So one needs to do both, but in what proportion? If you are a Pacific island, um, how much of mitigation do you need to do? You do have to adapt big time. So that brings in within the adaptation mitigation axis or divide another factor which is very particular to climate change, which is there is the global side and there's the local side. Mitigation has to happen globally. It's not enough for one country to mitigate, all right? Adaptation, on the other side, of course, has a lot of regional and global aspects as well. But a country might find it in its own interest much more clearly without worrying about free ridership of others, etc., in capturing the benefits of the money that you put into adaptation. That may be why you see multilateral organization historically worried about mitigation much more than adaptation, because mitigation funds from a country level would always be running short, because people are worried that if I did something and my neighbor didn't, it's a free rider problem. So anyway, we have adaptation and mitigation. The two combined, I would argue, is the essence of resilience that we discussed before, both of them. And then you have the global side and the local side. The global side clearly being very important for mitigation. Of course, it has to be added up from the local side, but adaptation very much seen by countries as being in their own interest, but it still doesn't mean enough is being invested in that.
It's a presentation at the European Evaluation Society last year about mitigation and adaptation from a panel of international agencies. And they argued that mitigation tends to be more concrete, that mitigation tends to have fairly concrete outcomes, but that adaptation is so open-ended and unknown and uncertain that they're finding it very difficult to fund adaptation because it's not known what's going to happen, that it's happening in real time, it's happening, as you said, collaboratively, it's happening in response to changing conditions, and that because they don't know how to write proposals and fund and budget adaptation, that most of the money is going into mitigation because that ends up being more concrete proposals. That also is an evaluation problem. If you can specify in mitigation what the results are going to be, a restored habitat, versus how people are going to adapt to unknown events, how you evaluate increased resilience and adaptation appears to be both a funding and an evaluation problem. Help people sort that out.
Absolutely. Mitigation projects, infrastructure, energy transition, investing in renewables, those can be measured much more clearly. And there are tools in the toolbox to do that. And so they get funded. The proposals are better or neater, and so on. Adaptation, as you rightly said, is a bit more amorphous. Yes, the example that makes it much more complicated would be, say, mangroves. Protecting mangroves, huge social benefits, but hard to put numbers on it, and the investors probably shy away because a lot of the benefits are social.
The book is Risk and Resilience in the Era of Climate Change. What are the most important messages you want people to take away from the book?
And say that what we used to think of as perhaps black swans, things that are pretty serious if they hit you, but you don't expect them to happen every few years. So they are black swans. But they are turning into perhaps gray rhinos. They are deadly and they are more frequent. And I would almost say that in the case of climate change, the idea that it's all very uncertain is giving way to certainty that something will happen. You don't know exactly when and where, but you therefore need to take that into account in all our work, including evaluation. Out of that, the second message in a way would be then that prevention or being prepared or building up resilience ahead of time, the idea of preventing what might happen down the road is a difficult one to get politics and economics behind. So that becomes my second message in the new world that we are living in. And then the third message, when you think about it, having squandered a good deal of time, decades, in pursuing unsustainable growth, we've reached a point that it was always good to have transformational change, but it's become a necessity in the sense that even if our goal continues to be GDP growth, which I objected to at the very beginning, that even would not be possible without transformational change, because the impact of climate change on lives and livelihoods, including the migration point that you mentioned, all of that would make sustainable livelihoods that much more difficult. So I guess my three messages would be the greater frequency of events, the need, therefore, to build in more prevention as well as response, and then transformational change as a necessity rather than a good thing to do only.
Well, thank you for the book. Thank you for the interview. I hope people take a close look at the book. It's a serious and important analysis of where we are. The overall picture remains one of urgency to deal with risk and resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. And I appreciate your insights into this.
Thank you very much, Michael.